A grand cathedral stands beneath a cloudy, petal-strewn sky, setting the stage for a momentous event. Inside the grand hall, priests and nuns oversee a glowing, multifaceted crystal orb resting on an ornate pedestal. A young man receives his class assessment from the church officials, learning that his suitable profession is a soldier. The official immediately calls for the next person to step forward for their assessment. A young girl eagerly responds to the call, stepping up with a bright smile while a dark-haired boy waits anxiously behind her. The watching crowd murmurs in anticipation about Chris Sparring, the twin son of a famous martial family, wondering what prestigious job he will receive. This grand ceremony is known as the Ritual of Heavenly Grace, a pivotal moment for the kingdom's youth. In the kingdom of Meldrake, every 16-year-old undergoes this life-defining ritual to reveal their profession and skills, knowing that high-class combat roles guarantee lifelong preferential treatment from the state. Chris reflects on his rigorous upbringing, burdened by his father's intense expectations to secure a superior profession and become the next family head. Called to the pedestal, Chris steps forward with firm resolve, desperately hoping to avoid humiliation and live up to his family's name. The presiding bishop hovers his hand over the glowing orb, officially declaring the suitable career for the tense Chris Sparring. To everyone's shock, the orb reveals Chris's profession to be a mere farmer with the associated skill of poison resistance. Chris freezes in absolute disbelief, staring blankly as the crushing reality of his low-tier class shatters his life's training. Whispers erupt through the cathedral as the bewildered crowd processes the shocking revelation that a sparring heir is just a farmer. Someone in the crowd openly balks at the absurd idea of him being relegated to agricultural work. Pitying onlookers offer hollow condolences and pats on the back, urging the devastated boy to cheer up despite the overwhelming shame. Amidst his despair, Chris catches sight of his twin brother, Klaus, who offers a gentle, unreadable smile. As Klaus steps forward for his turn, the attending nuns swoon over his gentle demeanor, assuming he must be worried about matching his brother's failure. Chris hyperventilates while staring at his heavily scarred and calloused hands, a physical testament to his years of brutal training. Overwhelmed by despair, he questions the purpose of all his grueling effort and endless sacrifices up to this exact moment. The somber mood is instantly shattered when the crowd erupts in awe, realizing that Klaus has just awakened the legendary holy sword profession. Bystanders gasp in reverence, noting that Klaus is only the fifth person in history to receive this divine, hero-tier calling. The sheer magnitude of Klaus's blessing echoes through the grand hall, drawing awe from every corner of the cathedral. Outside the church, their father beams with immense pride, heavily praising Klaus for securing the family's legacy and urging him to be a great leader. Trembling and seeking a shred of comfort, Chris hesitantly approaches his celebrating father. The warm, celebratory atmosphere instantly evaporates as the family patriarch turns to look at his other son with pure, unadulterated disgust. The father's face contorts into a terrifying scowl of rage, glaring down at the trembling boy who failed to meet his expectations. Furiously disowning his child, the father screams at Chris to get out of his house, enraged that his years of strict training produced a mere farmer with an emotionless face. Banished from the grand sparring estate, Chris is cast out into the world and branded as an utterly useless thing by the only family he knows. Battered from being used as a literal punching bag during yesterday's training, the exiled boy gathers his meager belongings into a single satchel. As he turns to leave his old life behind, Chris is suddenly halted by the arrival of his twin brother, Klaus. Staring through the gate, Klaus notes that he just saved their family's reputation, addressing his outcast twin with a shifting demeanor. The facade of the gentle, sickly brother melts away as Klaus covers his face, revealing a deeply twisted and malicious sneer. Spreading his arms in dramatic mockery, the newly crowned holy sword chides his brother for leaving without offering a proper thank you. Clenching his fists in frustration, Chris demands to know why this virtual stranger of a brother feels the need to torment him now. Chris flashes back to their childhood, remembering how the sickly Klaus was pampered by their mother while he endured their father's brutal, relentless training. Growing up, Klaus had always remained aloof and distant, ensuring the twin brothers never shared a single genuine conversation. Klaus erupts into absolute, manic laughter, mocking his brother's sheer ignorance before demanding if he truly doesn't understand the situation. Dropping the act completely, Klaus snarls that he was the one originally abandoned by their father, purely because Chris was born 10 minutes earlier. Walking away into the unknown, Chris solemnly reflects on his brother's hidden resentment, finally realizing the deep-seated bitterness that had festered within Klaus all these years. Remembering his mother, Chris's scarred face drops in absolute disbelief. Chuckling darkly, Klaus reveals that if he had the choice, he was the one who wanted things to change the most. Mocking his brother's new title of farmer, Klaus aggressively gloats that God was on his side by bestowing him with the holy sword. Pushed beyond his breaking point, Chris furiously screams at Klaus to shut up. Instantly escalating the conflict, Klaus draws his gleaming blade and aims the tip right at his brother's face. Smiling sadistically, Klaus warns his brother not to get mad unless he wants to be killed right then and there. Refusing to back down, Chris glares fiercely and tightens his bandaged grip on his wooden practice sword. Laughing at the sheer audacity of a lowly farmer daring to fight the holy sword, Klaus accepts the challenge as Chris declares he is ready anytime. With a patronizing sigh, Klaus lazily swings his massive blade onto his shoulder. Stealing his resolve, Chris reminds himself that despite his farmer profession, his years of rigorous childhood training should guarantee an expected result. Suddenly erupting with blinding power, Klaus lunges forward and shouts that it hasn't ended yet. Staring with cold, dead eyes, Klaus flatly declares the matter settled as he has no interest in the weak. Letting his true murderous intent slip, Klaus completely loses his gentle facade and vows to kill him. Screaming for Chris to die, Klaus unleashes a devastating energy wave called Sacred Slash. Miraculously, the catastrophic attack misses, leaving Chris sprawled beside a massive crater. Sighing nonchalantly, Klaus rests his sword on his shoulder and casually complains about using too much strength. Paralyzed by the sheer display of power, Chris mutters in total disbelief. Trembling on the ground, Chris realizes that no matter how hard he tried to master swordsmanship, it was completely useless. He completely despairs, understanding that his lifelong effort is meaningless in front of the world's best profession. Shadowed by the settling dust of his own attack, Klaus stands ominously while Chris concludes that this absurd power discrepancy makes absolutely no sense. Realizing his prey is fleeing, a furious Klaus violently demands his brother come back here. Enraged by the escape, Klaus screams his twin's name into the night. Far away from the manor, a vast and untamed forest sprawls beneath the cloudy, moonlit sky. Deep within the quiet woods, falling leaves drift slowly between the thick, towering tree trunks. Panting heavily, a battered and exhausted Chris limps deeper into the overgrown wilderness. Dragging his injured body through the brush, Chris finally stops to catch his breath. Emerging from the dense thicket, he discovers a quiet, isolated pond illuminated by the night sky. Collapsing by the water's edge with a painful grunt, Chris removes his boot to inspect his aching foot. Leaning back against a massive tree trunk, Chris wonders what he should do now that he has successfully escaped. A terrifying image of Klaus's shadowy, sadistic smile flashes through his traumatized mind. Sweating with pure dread, Chris realizes that his brother was seriously trying to kill him and will surely finish the job next time. Examining the meager rations he has left, Chris decides he must hide in the forest to avoid whoever might be chasing him. Tightening the bandages around his arm, he laments that he cannot hunt animals or monsters for food in his current injured condition. Pushing through the pain, the young exile ventures even deeper into the foreboding treeline. He scans the unfamiliar wilderness, keeping a sharp eye out for any immediate threats. Despite having hunted in the Pesha forest with his father many times, Chris notes there is strangely no sign of animals or monsters this deep inside. Searching for a safe haven, his eyes land on a small, secluded cave nestled between massive boulders. After roughly cleaning the simple interior, Chris feels relieved that he finally has a place to stay protected from the wind and rain. Figuring all that is left to do is wait for time to pass, his train of thought is suddenly interrupted by his violently growling stomach. Staring deadpan at a massive, plump bug crawling into the cave, a starving Chris debates if eating it should truly be his last resort. Emerging from a makeshift rock shelter, the exiled Chris realizes he urgently needs to find something to eat. He stumbles upon a patch of bizarre, sleeping plant life with broad leaves and rounded, face-like blooms. Examining the strange flora, Chris notes that his toxic resistance skill will likely keep him alive no matter what he eats, a silver lining he is finally glad to use. Taking a leap of faith, he brings one of the peculiar leaves to his mouth and takes a hesitant bite. The overwhelming bitterness immediately forces him to his knees, though he begrudgingly notes that the leaves hold a slight sweetness beneath the disgusting flavor. A variety of bizarre, alien-looking flowers and bell-shaped plants litter the dense undergrowth of the forest. Nibbling on a tiny, thorny sprig, he cringes as the plant yields nothing but pure bitterness and astringency. Staring up at the dark canopy, Chris sighs in exhaustion, realizing that forcing down these foul plants only drains his energy further. He continues foraging through the underbrush, examining a giant mushroom, a cluster of bumpy berries, and a spiky, toothy shoot. Gathering his strange harvest, he deduces that the more bizarre a plant looks, the more likely it is to have edible flavors beyond pure bitterness, with the Ninmenka being a notable exception. Crouching beside a dark log, Chris stares in dismay at a muddy puddle, knowing his remaining problem is finding a clean source of drinking water. He curses himself for wandering too deep into the forest and getting utterly lost, desperately wishing he could remember the way back to the stream. Cupping the filthy, blackish sludge in his hands, he relies entirely on his toxic resistance, hoping it will protect his body from harm. Kneeling before the murky puddle, Chris braces himself and lowers his head to take a desperate drink. Knowing he will die of dehydration otherwise, he forces the dark liquid past his lips and immediately gags into his hands. Tears prick his eyes as the foul, bitter liquid hits his tongue, overwhelming his senses with a horrific stench and a deeply foreign sensation. He violently dry heaves, overwhelmed by the miserable reality of having absolutely no decent food or clean drinking water. Night falls over the forest, and a thoroughly exhausted Chris collapses onto the hard stone floor of a shallow cave beneath the moonlight. In his sleep, he is haunted by a vivid nightmare of his brother Klaus's twisted smile, a memory that strikes him like a physical blow. Chris jolts awake in a cold sweat, gasping for air as he stares blankly at the cracked wall of his makeshift shelter. Sitting up as morning light cuts through the cave entrance, he takes a moment to steady his breathing and ground himself. Sunlight filters fully through the dense canopy of the ancient, twisted trees outside his refuge. Pushing forward to survive, Chris catches a plump striped grub, endures a heavy rainstorm in his cave, and sharpens a crude wooden spear. His eyes widen in absolute elation upon spotting meat, marking a major turning point after wandering the Peisha forest for several days. Peeking from behind a tree, he locks his sights on the carcass of a horned beast, thrilled to have finally found an animal. Despite the corpse being completely rotten and smelling foul enough to confuse his nose, he eagerly anticipates the meal, planning to mask the stench by grilling it with wild vegetables. A large chunk of the scavenged meat cooks on a makeshift wooden spit over a crackling campfire, sending thick smoke into the air. The resulting dish is a thick slab of dark, rotten meat generously seasoned and grilled with wild rosemary. Chris takes a massive bite from the skewer, chewing thoughtfully as he admits it tastes worse than any meat he has ever eaten. Regardless of the awful taste, he devours the meal with savage intensity, treating the spoiled flesh like a super delicious dish to satisfy his starving body. Staring at the empty skewers scattered around the dying fire, he sighs in deep satisfaction, grateful to finally have a full stomach after so long. Walking past a hollow stump, he reflects that while the forest is not dangerous, the sheer lack of living things has made obtaining food incredibly difficult. Sitting alone amidst the chirping birds, he decides it is time to hunt animals and monsters, noting that the herbal mix miraculously healed his injured leg. Suddenly, a sharp rustling sound behind him catches his attention, causing him to whip his head around in high alert. Pushing through the thick ferns, he carefully inspects the area and spots distinct traces left deep in the tall grass. Following the trail downward, he discovers several heavy, bare footprints pressed firmly into the soil. Lifting his face to the wind, he catches the faint, musky smell of beasts lingering in the air. He quietly ducks behind a massive tree trunk, peering cautiously around the bark to identify his new target. His eyes widen in shock as he finally gets a clear view of the massive creature making the tracks. Standing tall in a tattered white tunic is a hulking, muscular orc, its tusks bared as it stalks through the forest clearing. Assessing his homemade wooden stick, Chris realizes that without his father's combat skills, fighting the orc is extremely dangerous since their raw physical strength is nearly identical. Ignoring the towering orc lunging toward him, a starving Chris focuses entirely on his desperate craving for meat. He swiftly pivots to the side as the massive creature crashes down right past him. Locking his eyes onto his prey, Chris zeroes in on the beast's thick, exposed neck. Unfazed by the miss, the hulking monster straightens up and prepares for another strike. Tightening his grip on the makeshift club, Chris braces his legs for the incoming assault. Smirking at the creature's aggression, Chris feels relieved that his dinner hasn't decided to run away. Provoked by the human stance, the orc unleashes a deafening, blood-curdling roar. The massive beast charges blindly forward while Chris drops his stance to wait for the perfect opening. Spotting a critical gap in the monster's defense, Chris screams and launches his counterattack. Putting all his weight behind the swing, he buries the wooden club deep into the orc's fleshy abdomen. The immense force of the impact completely shatters his only weapon, leaving him momentarily defenseless. Chris instantly leaps backward to avoid being crushed as the giant creature violently collapses to the ground. Staring at the unmoving body in pure disbelief, Chris wonders if he truly managed to kill the beast with a single strike. Gasping for air, the paralyzed orc coughs up a thick puddle of dark blood. Chris realizes the creature isn't dead, but the devastating internal wound is so deep it simply cannot move. Taking responsibility for the kill, Chris decides to eat the meat, confident that his poison-resistant skill will protect him even if it rots. He laments the lack of clean water to properly prepare the meal but accepts he has absolutely no other choice. Knowing a field butchery would make transportation too difficult, he resolves to carry the entire carcass back to his cave. Hoisting the massive beast onto his shoulders, Chris is genuinely shocked to find it isn't nearly as heavy as he expected. Arriving back at his secluded camp, an exhausted Chris wipes the sweat and grime from his forehead. Despite the tedious effort required to carve up the massive body, he is absolutely thrilled by the large pile of meat he accumulates. Hanging the choice cuts on a makeshift wooden rack, he sets aside enough for 2 days and begins carefully drying the rest. Reeking of blood, he spots a murky pond and decides he must avoid getting even filthier before his meal. Large, thick chunks of fresh orc meat sizzle tantalizingly over a crackling campfire. Brushing aside the societal taboo of eating a humanoid monster, a starving Chris decides he couldn't care less. Staring hungrily at his skewer, he is pleasantly surprised to find it smells exactly like fresh meat instead of rotting flesh. Bracing himself for a potentially horrid flavor, Chris nervously takes a massive bite off the skewer. His eyes widen in absolute, unadulterated bliss as the rich flavor explodes across his tongue. Praising the extraordinary dish, Chris feels the juicy, sweet aroma shoot straight to his pleasure centers. Slumping onto the dirt with a bloated stomach, he guiltily realizes he just devoured tomorrow's rations as well. Flopping flat onto his back, a thoroughly satisfied Chris completely abandons his plans to try other preparation methods. Gazing up at the ceiling, he sharply recalls the immense physical effort it usually takes to fight such a beast. Having dismantled orcs with his own hands before, he knows their fat hides an incredibly thick layer of armor-like muscle. He stares at his hand in total disbelief, realizing it should have been impossible to inflict a fatal wound and carry the heavy beast back so effortlessly. Inspecting his glowing palm, Chris wonders if the farmer blessing somehow miraculously over-enhanced his raw physical strength. A startling revelation hits him as he questions if being brutally beaten to the brink of death by Klaus triggered this sudden power surge. He theorizes that his body might be operating on extreme muscle-building logic, recovering from critical damage to become drastically stronger than before. Relaxing under the night sky, Chris decides that regardless of the exact reason, easily defeating the monster was a massive stroke of luck. Reinvigorated by the hearty meal and his mysterious newfound power, Chris picks up a heavy log and immediately resumes his rigorous training. Trudging up a grassy incline, the exiled Chris continues his solitary trek through the forest as evening shadows fall. Stopping beside a tree covered in deep tally marks, he grips his crude knife and reflects that a full month has passed. Sitting before a campfire piled with clean bones, he acknowledges that his pampered past self would have tossed away the terrible orc meat. Having learned the agonizing pain of true starvation, he realizes he can no longer afford to waste a single scrap of food. Emerging from his makeshift cave, Chris decides his time in the Pasha forest is over because he cannot survive on bitter plants alone. Staring up at the bright sky, he sets his sights on finding a nearby city in the hopes that his family drama has finally calmed down. Walking down a sunlit forest ridge, he solidifies his current goal to survive, train endlessly, and grow immensely strong. Eyes burning with renewed determination, he swears to become powerful enough to utterly shock his father and Klaus. Shedding his filthy, tattered garments, he approaches the edge of a pristine river. Plunging into the cool water, he wildly splashes his face and washes away a month's worth of accumulated grime. Soaking peacefully in the clear stream, he is overwhelmed with deep emotion just from tasting the clean water he once took for granted. Standing on the riverbank, Chris stares blankly at his utterly ruined clothes, knowing he cannot enter civilization looking like a vagrant. Improvising a solution, he ties a crude leather bag made of orc skin around his waist to make himself look slightly more presentable. Arriving at the massive stone gates of a bustling settlement, he marvels at the grand architecture and massive crowds. He steps into the incredibly prosperous and lively streets of Exiled, a major city neighboring the royal capital. Taking in the heavy crowds and passing carriages, he notes that this city is far enough from his hometown to serve as a perfect hiding place. Gazing up at a towering palace in the distance, he figures the newly awakened Holy Sword Klaus is likely being summoned to the royal capital. Chris decides to use this neighboring city as his base of operations, knowing its proximity makes it perfectly easy to spy on his brother. Relieved that the guards barely checked him, he walks through the streets unarmed, acutely aware of how much his strange attire makes him stand out. Staring down at his meager handful of stolen coins, he realizes he needs a massive sum to buy food, lodging, clothes, and weapons. Looking up at the city's towering rooftops, he desperately acknowledges that he needs to find a way to make more money immediately. Wandering the streets, he spots the hanging sign for a grand, reputable props shop named Goldbone. Stepping inside, he is greeted by a polite attendant who immediately offers to guide the new customer to the appraiser's room. Following the attendant to the back room, Chris confidently plans to pawn off his stolen items, trusting a large company to deal fairly. The welcoming atmosphere shatters instantly as the monocled appraiser glares at the rugged, scruffy boy in absolute, silent disgust. Without a word, a thoroughly rejected Chris steps back out into the hall as the heavy wooden door slams shut behind him. Standing awkwardly in the corridor, he overhears the furious appraiser screaming at the attendant for letting a worthless beggar into the store. Walking back out into the city square, Chris sighs and admits his suspicious outfit makes him entirely untrustworthy to high-end merchants. From the shadows of a nearby alleyway, a small, cloaked figure silently spies on the wandering boy. Searching for looser merchants, Chris wanders into a dilapidated, heavily damaged slum filled with patchwork tents and crumbling walls. Walking past ragged citizens and patched awnings, he finds it incredibly hard to believe this ruined sector is still part of the grand city. He frowns at the unmarked, shadowy tents lining the alley, entirely unable to tell what kind of illegal goods they might be selling. A cloaked figure suddenly bumps heavily into his side while he is distracted by the lack of merchant signboards. Turning toward the nervous, hooded stranger clutching something tightly, Chris gently asks if the person is lost. Without a word of warning, the stranger suddenly hurls a tightly bound sphere directly at Chris's face. The sphere violently detonates upon impact, erupting into a blinding flash of white light that throws Chris backward. Reeling from the blast, a completely blinded and disoriented Chris winces in sudden agony. Recovering his vision, he rubs his stinging eyes and furiously shouts at the fleeing cloaked figure. Reaching into his pockets to assess the damage, he freezes as pure, unadulterated frustration boils over. Grinding his teeth in explosive rage, Chris realizes the little street rat just made off with all of his stolen goods. Sprinting through the bustling market, Chris fiercely chases after a hooded figure. Pushing his way past the busy stalls, he notes how the fleeing thief seems far too accustomed to using the dense throng to her advantage. Just as the evasive target slips away, Chris reaches out and firmly snags the trailing edge of her cloak. Yanking her backward, Chris angrily scolds the thief for taking advantage of the townspeople's friendliness. The sudden pull stops the thief dead in her tracks as she gasps in complete surprise. Flailing wildly in panic, the hooded figure struggles to escape until Chris threatens to punch her if she doesn't stop shouting. Pulling her into a quiet alleyway, Chris is shocked to discover the thief is just a trembling girl around his own age. Staring down at the tearful girl, Chris suddenly feels guilty as he questions why she stole his belongings. Sobbing with her hands covering her face, she mumbles about being beaten if she speaks, prompting Chris to point out he can't understand her anyway. The frightened girl softly explains that she steals merely for the sake of surviving, claiming there is no other reason at all. Narrowing his eyes, Chris deduces her skillful thievery implies she isn't a novice and wonders why she didn't target wealthier victims. Probing deeper into her situation, Chris interrogates the defenseless girl about any potential accomplices or parents. Trapped by his sharp questions, the girl forces a hesitant, awkward laugh before looking away nervously. Sweating profusely under his gaze, the terrible liar frantically stammers a denial about having any accomplices. Losing his patience, Chris threatens to hand her over to the soldiers if she doesn't stop lying and tell the absolute truth. He closes his eyes with a heavy sigh, silently admitting to himself that he desperately wants to avoid the authorities at all costs. Terrified by the threat of arrest, the girl finally confesses she lives with one other person in an abandoned building. Kneeling submissively on the ground, she quickly confirms Chris's suspicion that her partner also works as a thief. Grabbing her roughly by the collar, Chris aggressively demands to know if her partner is nearby, terrifying the sobbing girl even further. Trembling uncontrollably, the crying girl points down the alley and assures him she'll be safe if she can just make it over there. Meanwhile, a young man sits alone in a ruined building, anxiously wondering if his partner has been caught since she is running so late. Hearing the door creak open, the boy curses under his breath as the tearful girl admits she was captured. The boy instantly draws his dagger to attack, but the girl cries that the terrifying stranger threatened to hurt her if she didn't bring him there. Unimpressed by the boy's terrible combat stance, Chris casually steps into the room and announces he just came to give them a warning. Startled by the sudden intrusion, the boy barks that they have absolutely no money to give him. Resting his hand calmly on the girl's head, Chris flatly states he isn't there for money, prompting the boy to drop his weapon in sheer confusion. Staring at the baffled duo, Chris demands some critical information in exchange for letting them off with a mere warning. Chris explains that he just arrived in Exiled and needs them to point him toward the central district. Stunned by the unexpectedly simple request, the boy named Rarf asks the girl, Hesta, if she seriously agrees to help the guy who caught her. Turning toward the door, Chris casually mentions he'll also need their names while reminding them they have no choice but to comply. Flustered and completely shocked, Rarf yells in panic as Chris correctly guesses their names based on what they called each other earlier. Grumbling in utter defeat, Rarf agrees to guide him but aggressively clarifies he has absolutely no intention of being friendly. The unlikely trio exits the rundown building and begins navigating the cobblestone streets of the sprawling city together. Looking up at the towering architecture, Chris sincerely thanks the pair for helping him find his way. Observing his reluctant guides, Chris notes to himself that whether they like it or not, they clearly aren't thrilled about assisting him. Stopping suddenly in his tracks, Chris tells them to wait because they haven't introduced him to the most important place yet. Glancing back in confusion, Rarf casually mentions they usually sell their stolen goods at an acquaintance's pawn shop. Chris stares deadpan at the two thieves and demands they show him the exact way there immediately. Leaning in closely, Chris assures the suspicious pair that he doesn't harbor any bad intentions. Leaving Rarf completely dumbfounded, Chris casually reveals he simply wants to sell some stolen goods of his own. Angrily defending himself, Ralph snaps that Chris is no different from them, arguing that stealing his own father's belongings is still theft. Unfazed by the accusation, Chris states he doesn't care if they steal from others as long as they don't steal from him, offering to overlook their crime if they act as his guides. A nervous Ralph and Hesta stare in disbelief, double-checking if Chris is truly willing to let them go without reporting them to the guards. Chris calmly confirms his promise, noting that the location they are heading to will be their final stop together. The trio arrives at a grand, intricately carved merchant building tucked away in the bustling city. As they approach, a familiar voice calls out from the shadows, casually greeting Ralph and Hesta. The merchant notices the newcomer and asks what is going on, prompting Ralph to explain that they just met Chris and he wants to sell some items. Stepping out from the darkness, the shadowy figure agrees to do business and invites them inside. Standing before a shelf of goods, the merchant politely asks for his new customer's name. The elderly man introduces himself as Rugence, extending a welcoming hand as Chris offers his own name in return. Chris places his stolen goods on the table, revealing a pristine pocket watch, a pearl necklace, a ring and a set of earrings. Examining the valuable items with a monocle, Rugence instructs Chris to look around the shop while he carefully appraises the haul. Browsing the weapons rack, Chris realizes that a decent sword costs 5 gold coins, making everything far beyond his current non-existent budget. His attention is suddenly drawn to a strange, ancient-looking book titled The Memoirs of Botanist Otto, a work by an author he has never heard of. Staring at the exorbitant price tag of 3 gold coins, Chris wonders what makes the book so special and wishes he could afford it. Hesta walks up beside him, surprised, and asks if he actually knows how to read the bizarre characters on the cover. When Chris confirms he was taught to read since childhood, Hesta stares at him intently with a trailing thought. Catching his confused look, she quickly dismisses her thought just as Rugence announces he has finished the appraisal. Returning to the counter, Rugence offers to buy all of the jewelry if Chris finds his pricing acceptable. The appraiser lays out the silver, pricing the ring at 4 coins and the earrings at 2. Chris is genuinely shocked when Rugence values the necklace at a staggering 3 gold coins. Overhearing the exchange, a flabbergasted Ralph interrupts, exclaiming that Rugence rarely offers such high prices, though the merchant calmly points out the necklace's embedded sapphire. Scolding Ralph for interfering in a private negotiation, Rugence sighs while the thief excitedly asks if Chris is secretly from a rich family. Finally, Rugence examines the pocket watch and prices it at exactly 1 gold coin. Staring at the timepiece, Chris feels a twinge of disappointment, realizing his father's deeply treasured watch is worth much less than he assumed. Making his decision, Chris agrees to sell all of the jewelry but chooses to keep the pocket watch for himself. A neat pile of coins is placed on the counter, and Chris sincerely thanks the appraiser for his immense help. Rugence smiles knowingly, explaining that pricing stolen goods below market value ensures both parties benefit without any worry. Gathering the purchased jewelry, the old merchant asks if Chris has anything else he wishes to sell. Pointing toward the shelves, Chris admits there is one item in the shop that caught his eye. Rugence pulls down the botanical memoir, chuckling that very few people ever pay attention to this particular book. The merchant acknowledges Chris's confusion over the price, confirming that the author is entirely unknown and accomplished nothing extraordinary. However, Rugence passionately declares that the book's contents are a literary masterpiece to anyone knowledgeable enough to understand them. Intrigued but broke, Chris admits he cannot afford it right now and hopes it will still be there the next time he visits. To Chris's absolute surprise, Rugence offers to let him take the book today and pay for it whenever he gets the money. Feeling awkward, Chris hesitates, questioning why a merchant would extend such blind trust to a guest actively selling stolen goods. Rugence chuckles warmly, assuring the skeptical boy that he wouldn't make such a generous offer to just anyone. He pragmatically explains that since the book hasn't sold in years, letting Chris take it now guarantees a profit eventually. With a sly grin, Rugence adds that if Chris fails to pay, he will simply collect the debt from Ralph, causing the young thief to panic. Stepping back out into the city, Chris happily accepts the deal while Ralph yells in the background that he absolutely refuses to cover the cost. Thanking his 2 reluctant guides, Chris cheerfully points out that their help allowed him to make more money in an instant than most people earn in months of hard work. Catching the thieves completely off guard, Chris offers to treat them both to a meal since they never got a chance to eat earlier. Ralph glances down at Hesta and logically agrees that letting someone else buy them food is much better than wandering the streets with empty pockets. Glaring with deep suspicion, Ralph demands to know why Chris would ever treat the very people who tried to rob him. Turning his gaze toward the sky, Chris admits to himself that after a lonely month surviving in the wilderness, simply having someone to talk to is a massive comfort. Pushing through heavy wooden doors, the trio enters a warm, bustling tavern filled with lively patrons. Cheerful chatter and hearty laughter echo through the dining hall as the locals enjoy their evening feasts. Taking a seat around a sturdy wooden table, the unlikely trio settles into the noisy tavern atmosphere. Ralph stops mid-bite and stares forward in absolute, wide-eyed disbelief. Ignoring all social graces, a famished Chris furiously shovels massive spoonfuls of food into his mouth while towering stacks of empty plates pile up around him. Wiping his mouth, Chris compliments the tavern's cooking and casually mentions that he survived entirely on unseasoned orc meat during his exile. Shocked by this revelation, Ralph listens in horror as Chris casually adds that he avoided starvation by eating literally anything he could find, including muddy water and poisonous plants. Taking a calm sip from his wooden mug, Chris explains that his toxic resistance skill protected him from any fatal consequences. Ralph stares at Chris in total disbelief, completely baffled by how casually he treats such a rare and valuable ability. Analyzing his new acquaintance, Ralph notes how surprisingly easygoing Chris is and explains that toxic resistance usually only minimizes side effects rather than granting full immunity. Hearing this explanation, Hesta suddenly gasps as a startling realization hits her. Pointing a trembling finger at Chris, a panicked Hesta shouts that this perfectly explains why her Alil ball failed to incapacitate him earlier. Chris's face drops in sheer, unadulterated horror as he realizes the strange red object that flew directly into his eyes was actually a chemical weapon. Sweating profusely, Ralph furiously scolds Hesta for using such a dangerous item, explaining that a single drop of an Alil ball's strong anesthetic can paralyze a person for an entire day. Ralph logically deduces that if Chris completely shrugged off the powerful anesthetic, his skill must have evolved from mere resistance into absolute, toxic nullification. Moving past the terrifying revelation, Ralph asks about his future plans, prompting the young exile to declare his goal of becoming an adventurer. Strolling down the moonlit streets, Chris explains that his swordsmanship training should help him earn enough money to easily survive each day. Stopping to look back, Chris turns the question on the two thieves and sternly asks if they seriously plan to survive by stealing forever. Staring down at his own calloused hands, Rarf bitterly admits that stealing is their only option since they lack the raw physical strength required to become adventurers. Ignoring Rarf's excuses, Chris bluntly warns them that if anyone else had caught them stealing, they would already be rotting in a prison cell. Reaching their destination, the trio stands before the grand, imposing architecture of the local Adventurers Guild. Inside the bustling guild hall, a polite receptionist informs Chris that the mandatory registration fee is a single silver coin. Placing his hand on a glowing magical orb, Chris quickly catches himself and registers using only his first name to hide his noble lineage. The receptionist pulls back a freshly printed card and officially declares his adventurer registration complete. Handing over the guild card, she explains that it serves as vital identification while tracking his completed quests and overall rank. Curious about the progression system, Chris asks for details and learns that completing beginner quests will gradually raise his rank and unlock much harder missions. The receptionist patiently lists the ascending ranks, starting from rookie and climbing all the way through bronze, silver, gold, platinum, mithril, diamond, orichalcum, and finally hierarchane. She notes that ranking up heavily depends on a mix of completed quests and appropriate skills, prompting Chris to ask about the specific stat requirements for each tier. Using a visual chart, the receptionist explains that rookies start with 10s across the board, while higher ranks demand exponentially more power. Satisfied with the thorough explanation, Chris declines any further questions and politely thanks the magical receptionist for her time. As Chris turns to leave the grand building, the receptionist offers a warm smile and wishes him the best of luck with his new career. The next morning, a bright sky stretches endlessly over the lush, untamed wilderness of the forest. Recalling the guild's bounty of 2 copper coins per goblin ear, Chris ventures into the brush to secure his very first official payday. Drawing his sharp new blade, Chris silently vows to land a clean, decisive blow this time to make up for his previously sloppy encounter with the orc. With a single lightning-fast horizontal slash, Chris brutally bisects the screeching goblin in a spectacular spray of dark blood. Reflecting on his recent battles, Chris mutters to himself about a lingering, inexplicable strangeness. He recalls cleaving a massive orc in half with absolute ease, noting how absurdly effortless the lethal strike felt even with a proper sword. Staring blankly, he realizes he has somehow awakened an extraordinary power, though the exact cause remains a complete mystery. Flashing back to a month ago, Chris remembers the defeated thieves begging to share a cheap hostel with him, an arrangement he accepted to save his own funds. The 2 former street rats have since abandoned their criminal ways to officially register as guild adventurers. Biting into an apple, Chris notes his own promotion to bronze rank and appreciates their newly stabilized life. Gazing out at the dense canopy, he resolves to return to the Payshaw forest tomorrow to test a burning hypothesis. He cracks open the dusty pages of botanist Otto's memoirs, instantly captivated by the detailed records of legendary plants and their miraculous effects. His eyes lock onto the most intriguing chapter of the entire book, detailing utterly unknown flora laced with incurable toxins. A drawing of an ominous sprout highlights the existence of lethal vegetation whose true properties remain a complete mystery to the world. Connecting the dots, Chris suspects that one of the foul-tasting weeds he consumed during his exile possessed secret, body-enhancing properties. His heart pounds with exhilarating realization as he figures out a direct path to acquiring unprecedented physical strength. Seeking answers, Chris steps into the grand, sunlit cathedral of the local church. Approaching the altar, he intends to use the church's status-checking service to measure his exact power levels before attempting his dangerous new diet. He mentally prepares himself to spend a precious gold coin, lacking any other way to accurately quantify his own strength. A polite cleric greets the young adventurer and quickly ushers him into a private testing chamber to undergo the evaluation. Waiting quietly in the empty chamber, Chris stares at the familiar, glowing assessment orb resting on the central pedestal. Glaring at the expensive artifact, he silently grumbles about the steep price of the church's absolute monopoly on status readings. The heavy wooden doors creak open as a high-ranking church official finally enters the room. The silver-haired man introduces himself as Parish Priest Graham, exchanging pleasantries with the expectant boy. Dismissing the idea of a confession, Priest Graham demands the gold coin and the boy's guild card to begin the appraisal. The priest channels his holy energy into the crystal sphere, unleashing a blinding light to read the boy's hidden statistics. Handing the updated card back, Graham abruptly excuses himself to attend to official church duties. Chris scowls at his single-digit stats, bitterly acknowledging that his raw physical numbers are still well below average despite his recent combat successes. Squinting at the engraved text, his eyes dart to the strange bracketed numbers printed right next to his base stats. A thrilling realization washes over him as he deduces that the bracketed numbers represent the exact power boosts he gained from the toxic flora. Staring at his updated class profile, Chris realizes the original appraiser made a massive mistake by identifying his ultra-rare poison nullification as mere toxic resistance. Geared up and hauling an oversized wicker backpack full of water flasks, Chris marches out under the twilight sky. A groggy Hester rubs her eyes in the dim hostel room, catching the heavily burdened boy sneaking out into the hall. Chris apologizes for the disturbance and asks her to tell Ralph he will be gone on an extended business trip, assuring her the rent is fully covered. Hester nods sleepily from her bed, accepting the message as Chris finally departs into the night. Looming on the horizon, the jagged, treacherous peaks of the Payshaw forest await the returning exile. Gripping his walking stick, Chris tirelessly hikes back up the steep, overgrown mountain trails he once called home. He pushes deep into the dark, silent canopy, navigating the familiar labyrinth of ancient roots and giant ferns. Pausing to catch his breath, he reflects on the sheer miracle of his survival, knowing his true skill saved him from starvation. Spotting a strange, lifeless insect on the cavern floor, he deduces the sterile nature of the forest's bizarre ecosystem. Finding a secure rock overhang, he drops his heavy pack and swiftly establishes a makeshift base camp. Without wasting a second, the eager adventurer reaches out and snaps the stem of a peculiar white flower. Sitting alone in the quiet wilderness, Chris pulls out his journal to meticulously document his botanical findings. Cross-referencing his newly acquired city knowledge, he excitedly realizes this barren forest is actually a massive, untapped goldmine of rare medicinal herbs. Chris carefully sketches in his journal, deciding to strictly gather unknown plant species for verification this time. Gazing out over the dense forest canopy, he laments that he was too focused on pure survival before to remember exactly what he ate. Taking a tentative bite of a spotted mushroom roasted over his campfire, he notes that the flavor is surprisingly decent. Suddenly overwhelmed by severe nausea, Chris violently covers his mouth as a wave of sickness hits him. Shivering miserably by the dying embers, he analyzes the dry, sour aftertaste while admitting it is still better than the bitter plants. Pushing past the discomfort, Chris shifts his focus to a large, menacing carnivorous plant for his next test. The monstrous plant aggressively snaps its jaws shut, making Chris groan in pure disgust. Choking down a sample, he violently gags upon realizing he just tasted a sour, rotten insect that the plant hadn't fully digested. Slumping weakly against a stone wall, a thoroughly repulsed Chris definitively concludes that the carnivorous plant is unfit for consumption. Staring down at his brimming basket of toxic mushrooms, he steels his resolve to complete his goal of gathering 30 poisonous species. Taking a moment to rest in the quiet woods, Chris meticulously examines a freshly plucked leaf while his collection baskets sit fully loaded nearby. The lush undergrowth thrives undisturbed, showcasing a wide, vibrant variety of strange flora and tall bamboo stalks. Hiking smoothly through the trees, he reflects on how peaceful the deep forest is without magical beasts, having easily gathered his 30 toxic samples in just a week. Glancing back at the untamed wilderness, Chris decides he will treat his next visit like a relaxing vacation. Staring up at the cloudy sky, he grimly reminds himself of the terrible reality of eating toxic foliage for every single meal. Returning to civilization, the young exile approaches a massive, ornate building within the bustling city. Inside the immaculate hall, a refined priest looks up with mild surprise as the young adventurer approaches. Apologizing for the sudden intrusion, Chris approaches the counter as the priest recognizes him from a recent visit. The priest channels magic into a glowing crystal orb to update the guild card, warning Chris that his abilities likely haven't changed in just a few days. Gripping his freshly updated card, a tense Chris thinks that his entire grueling week of eating toxic flora will be a complete waste if his stats haven't changed. His eyes widen in absolute triumph as he realizes his raw physical strength and endurance stats have miraculously increased by a single point. Marching excitedly out of the hall, Chris realizes that this tiny stat bump proves that consuming certain poisonous plants permanently enhances his raw abilities. He obsessively analyzes the glowing magical text on his guild card to fully understand his newly evolved growth potential. Clenching his fist with burning determination, he silently vows to use absolutely any extreme method necessary to gain more power. Meeting up later, a furious Ralph aggressively demands to know why Chris vanished for an entire week without a single word. Holding a paper bag full of fresh meat skewers, a completely baffled Chris points out that he specifically asked Hesta to pass on the message. As Hesta nervously apologizes, an exasperated Ralph covers his face and yells that Chris should have just told him directly instead of using a proxy. Chewing calmly on a skewer, Chris tells the panicking boy to calm down as Ralph frantically asks if he is abandoning their shared lodging. Ignoring the rapid-fire questions, Chris casually hands out the delicious, savory yakitori portions to his two hungry companions. Realizing Ralph won't stop pestering him otherwise, Chris prepares to explain his absence while the thief happily devours the unexpected treat. Dodging Ralph's casual questions about his success, Chris seriously explains that he returned to the deep forest for a week to investigate a lingering suspicion. A heavy silence falls over the group as the two thieves stare blankly at Chris, slowly processing the sheer insanity of voluntarily returning to that deadly wilderness. Staring at the floor in bitter self-deprecation, Ralph suddenly admits that he and Hesta are completely useless in comparison. Ralph vents his deep frustrations, calculating that their daily expenses for rent and food far exceed the measly silver coin they earn hunting goblins. Acknowledging their brutal living conditions, Chris listens as Ralph points out that a single injury would completely ruin their daily quota and lead to starvation. Sensing where the depressing conversation is heading, Chris immediately shuts down the idea before Ralph can even finish his sentence. Completely ignoring Chris's blunt rejection, an excited Ralph loudly demands they form a party together, only to be instantly shot down due to a lack of funds. Refusing to take no for an answer, Ralph and Hesta aggressively point out that Chris survived a whole week without working and still had enough money to buy them expensive meat. Narrowing his eyes, Chris firmly declares that his current financial stability is the direct result of his own grueling, life-threatening hard work. Glaring coldly at the stunned thieves, Chris threatens to take the food back if his simple act of kindness is going to be used to extort him. Chris silently acknowledges the boy's feelings but admits he lacks the spare money to help anyone, while the blonde youth awkwardly apologizes. Looking at the two kids, Chris wonders if there is any exploitable value to be found in them. He abruptly asks for their compatible professions and skills, startling them since ordinary people rarely share their weaknesses openly. Chris reassures them not to be cautious, noting he would have killed them long ago if he wanted to, and reminds them he already shared his own profession. He reiterates that his compatible profession is wizard, and his skill is magic healing. Hesta calmly accepts Chris, prompting Ralph to frantically yell and ask why she just revealed everything to him. Chris reflects that manipulating magic power is extremely difficult, requiring study at a magic school or through grimoires to actually cast spells as a wizard. He notes that magic schools are restricted to top nobles or those with the highest level blessing, making grimoires exorbitant and cementing wizard as the weirdest combat profession. Hesta confesses she started stealing to buy magic grimoires because she wants to unlock the potential of becoming a wizard, a fate slightly better than her unlucky farmer profession. Chris asks if she remembers asking him if he could read back when they first met at the Misfortune family. Gripping her knees nervously, Hesta stammers out a hesitant request regarding her future pursuit of a magic grimoire. Blushing deeply and averting her eyes, she asks Chris if he can teach her how to read. Chris easily agrees, acknowledging that a properly trained wizard can rival high-level combat professions and noting Hesta's future potential. Hesta's face instantly lights up with a bright, hopeful smile. She enthusiastically thanks him, while a flustered Ralph watches them bond. Chris then turns his attention to Ralph, prompting the boy to defensively yell that he won't reveal his profession. Without hesitation, Hesta blurts out that Ralph is a holy knight with divine skills, causing Ralph to scream in betrayal. Chris realizes that holy knight is a high-ranking combat profession capable of joining the royal guard or becoming an elite adventurer. Hesta explains that Ralph seriously injured his knee as a child and still struggles to move properly due to the lingering pain. Grumbling about Hesta exposing his secrets, Ralph listens as Chris deduces that his strangely bad balance while drawing a dagger was caused by this knee injury. Ralph bitterly admits he accepted his bad luck long ago, and Chris remarks that they are probably the only combat party tripping over lowly goblins. When Chris suggests everything would be fine if his knee were healed, Ralph rejects the idea, stating village doctors declared it incurable since childhood. Ralph clenches his fist in frustration, insisting he didn't give up immediately and searched for other doctors, while Chris questions why he blindly trusted the village doctor's verdict. A flashback reveals a younger Ralph and Hesta sitting in a dilapidated alley, remembering the crushing despair of finding no cure. Chris understands they were just abandoned children without money or status, though he vaguely reassures them that their suffering won't last long. Stating that both of them have potential, Chris formally declares that he will form a party with the two of them. Hesta gasps in pure delight, while Ralph looks on in stunned disbelief. Chris inwardly reflects on the irony of someone like him, who was abandoned for his blessing ceremony results, now judging others based on those same results. To their confusion, Chris immediately adds a caveat, stating he does not want to team up as they currently are. He clarifies that they will officially form a party once they gain enough skill to hunt goblins with ease, reminding them he has his own tasks to handle. Hesta stammers that she only asked to form a party precisely because they cannot hunt goblins properly, accusing him of putting the cart before the horse. Chris simply looks back with a flat expression as Hesta stares intently, completely unamused by his impossible logic. Brushing off their protests, Chris declares the matter decided while Ralph dramatically panics in the background. Approaching the bustling Adventurers Guild building, Chris announces his intention to take on a quest. A cheerful guild receptionist informs him that he can now take on bronze-level quests and asks if he wants to try. She explains the various types of bronze-level quests available, prompting Chris to ask for more specific classifications. Standing before the quest board, the receptionist asks if he prefers large or small-scale exterminations, and he requests just a few options. Chris examines the papers, taking a moment to look over 4 specific quests she points out. The listings include exterminating lost cattle birds, baby lizards, hedro slimes near the Mitria River, and bubble wisps in an abandoned eastern village. Chris asks why some quests have designated locations while others do not, and the receptionist clarifies that for these specific quests, killing just one individual monster is sufficient. The guild receptionist explains that for quests without designated locations, adventurers must hunt specific monsters and bring back their bodies or specified parts to complete the request. Chris confirms his understanding that quests with designated locations simply involve exterminating harmful monsters. She notes that while these location-based quests take more time and effort, the rewards are sometimes higher than standard gathering tasks. Pointing to the board, the receptionist reveals that exterminating lost cattle birds offers the highest reward, paying up to 3 gold coins depending on the condition of the entire body brought back. Chris then asks about the lowest-paying quests, learning that hunting hedro slimes and bubble wisps only yields 4 silver coins. Pondering the disparity, he realizes that even the lowest-paying bronze-level quest only requires defeating 1 monster, which is equivalent in difficulty to 20 goblins. He acknowledges the risk of running out of money if he chooses a quest that takes too long to complete. Gripping the parchment tightly, Chris faces the critical decision of which quest to undertake. Venturing into a dense, atmospheric forest, he begins his hunt surrounded by fluttering insects and towering trees. Hiding behind a large tree trunk, Chris carefully observes his surroundings. He spots his target moving through the brush. A massive, dark hedro slime emerges on the uneven terrain before him. Disgusted by the pulsating, gelatinous creature, Chris recoils slightly at the sight. Despite wanting to give up because of the stench that might ruin his gear, his dwindling funds force him to push through the unexpectedly unpleasant mission. Noting that the slime is as tall as he is, Chris realizes he must be careful and targets the dark spot that serves as its core. Steeling his resolve, he locks his eyes onto the target and prepares to strike. Lunging forward with his sword drawn, he aims to finish the beast with one decisive blow. He thrusts his blade violently into the creature's core, causing a massive explosion of energy and dark fluid. Rebounding from the powerful impact, Chris watches as the slime convulses and sprays spikes in all directions. Cursing that one strike wasn't enough, he grips his sword with both hands and prepares for another attack. Leaping into the air, he brings his blade down in a devastating, sweeping arc. The force of the blow shatters the surrounding ground into jagged chunks of debris. Dark, viscous fluid erupts violently as the slime is finally torn apart by the impact. Dripping with foul sludge, a miserable Chris drops to his knees by the water and swears he will never accept this disgusting mission again. Learning from his foul encounter, a month passes smoothly without any further difficulties in completing bronze-ranked missions. Wiping sweat from his brow, he spends his remaining time practicing swordsmanship, studying plants, and filing daily mission reports. Amazed by his own relentless work ethic, Chris looks at his growing pile of coins, realizing he has managed to save up an impressive 20 gold coins. Returning to the Shichifukuya shop, he approaches the familiar old merchant to finally pay for the book he previously obtained. When the merchant kindly offers an installment plan, Chris confidently assures him that he has enough money to pay the full amount. Clutching a potion bottle, Chris expresses deep gratitude to Rujins for selling him the botanist memoirs, which taught him the vital potential of poisonous plants. The merchant smiles knowingly and accepts the payment. Handing over a small sack of coins, Chris thanks the merchant again for the incredibly useful knowledge. Shifting the topic, Chris asks if the shop sells necromancy scrolls, prompting a curious glance from the old man. The merchant stands and turns toward the cluttered shelves in the back of the room. Opening a secure lockbox, he pulls out an old, sealed container that indeed holds necromancy scrolls. Chris stares intently at the ominous, dark tome adorned with strange symbols and asks about its nature. The merchant reveals he kept the item specifically because Hesta asked him to, noting that he only offered the pay-later deal to Chris because Hesta would have just run away. Noting the lack of trust between the longtime acquaintances, Chris dryly points out their strange dynamic. When Chris asks the price, he is completely shocked to learn the merchant wants 2 platinum coins for the dark tome. Feeling foolish for contemplating the purchase all day, Chris balks at the absurdly expensive price of 2 platinum coins, which equals 20 gold. Chris holds a dark, expensive-looking grim, shocked that the merchant is allowing him to pay for it later in full instead of demanding money in advance. Gazing at the starry sky, Chris reflects that buying the necromancy scroll for Hesta to learn magic will make her a valuable asset and ultimately benefit him as well. Placing the heavy tome firmly back on the shelf, Chris politely declines the offer because he refuses to put himself in debt right now just for Hesta's sake. Standing outside the grand shop, the smiling merchant tells Chris that it is perfectly all right and invites him to return and buy the book anytime. Various types of freshly harvested leaves and toxic botanicals are spread out across a flat surface to dry. Holding a dried leaf up to the light, Chris notes he has enough spare money for a church ability check after foraging and eating half of the poisonous plants. He dramatically slumps over his wooden table in shivering disgust, groaning that the more the plants dry out, the more terribly bitter they taste. Looking out over the village rooftops, he realizes he needs to study and research proper preparation methods before trying to eat these toxic herbs again. He calculates that if his stats increase evenly again, he can safely conclude that the remaining poisonous plants won't enhance his abilities any further. Staring up at the towering architecture of the church, Chris quietly hopes that his test results won't be as unlucky this time around. He grimly assumes that since the church officials don't understand his rapid progress, they probably just think he is mindlessly throwing his money at them. A slightly bewildered priest notes that it hasn't been long since his last ability check, while Chris awkwardly apologizes for bothering him again so soon. Chris humbly reassures the priest that he won't complain even if his abilities haven't changed at all, prompting the holy man to yield and begin the process. Brilliant rays of sunlight stream beautifully through the intricately patterned stained glass windows of the church hall. Holding the glowing ability card over the magical ritual circle, the priest announces that the divine assessment is finally complete. The priest kindly smiles and offers words of comfort, assuring Chris that even if his abilities didn't change, his intense determination certainly hasn't failed him. Annoyed by the repetitive pity, Chris coldly excuses himself and turns away, while the priest awkwardly apologizes for being so irritatingly persistent. Checking his stats, Chris discovers his endurance and physical strength only increased by 1, which he attributes to a grueling month of active demon hunting rather than the plants. A heavy shadow falls over his face as he realizes all that relentless hunting only yielded the exact same stat increase as simply eating wild weeds. Analyzing a specific leafy stem under the moonlight, he concludes that certain poisonous plants definitely hold the hidden capability to make him significantly stronger. However, he determines that none of the dried plants he ate this time worked, making him fear that the moisture-draining drying process itself renders them completely ineffective. Approaching a small, rustic wooden house under the quiet night sky, Chris pauses on the porch as he hears a sudden commotion from inside. Opening the door, he finds Ralph and Hesta kneeling obediently side by side on the wooden floor, looking up at him with incredibly nervous expressions. Peeking through the slightly open entrance, Chris bluntly breaks the silence by asking what in the world the two of them are doing. Hesta excitedly shouts Chris's name, while Ralph suddenly yells in pain as the smaller girl forcefully shoves him down to silence him. Leaning forward with fierce determination, Hesta begs Chris to officially join their party now that they have cultivated enough strength to easily defeat goblins. Chris silently observes them, deeply surprised they reached this combat milestone so quickly after weeks of returning home completely exhausted. Chris calmly agrees to accompany them tomorrow to verify their progress, causing Hesta to beam with joy while commanding Ralph to express his gratitude too. He silently rationalizes that if they truly can slaughter goblins with ease, officially forming a party with them would finally become a highly beneficial arrangement. Strolling through the bustling village street later, Ralph happily offers Chris some grilled skewers he bought, earning a soft murmur of thanks from Hesta. Under the dim, flickering light of a single candle, Chris carefully crosses out specific lines of text in a thick, detailed journal with his quill. Sitting at his desk while Ralph watches from the doorway, Chris concludes it is a total waste of money and labor to eat those 15 ineffective herbs, resolving to disregard them. Ralph steps further into the dimly lit room, his face etched with concern, and hesitantly calls out to Chris to get his undivided attention. Pointing to a mysterious pile of dried plants scattered on the floor, Ralph asks what they are, and Chris bluntly informs him that the foliage is probably fatal. A horrified Ralph demands to know why he would bring lethal weeds into their shared home, but Chris calmly explains that the plants are perfectly safe as long as they aren't eaten. Chris deadpans that he intends to eat the fatal plants himself thanks to his poison nullification skill, leaving Ralph sweating and bewildered at the sheer insanity of the plan. Ralph incredulously asks if the deadly grass is actually delicious to consume, but Chris simply replies with a grim expression that it tastes absolutely terrible. The very next morning, the trio treks outdoors across a vast landscape under a bright sky, panting heavily from the extreme physical exertion. A deeply exhausted Ralph gasps that his injured leg is significantly slowing them down, finally realizing why Chris always insists they head out so early in the morning. Despite Ralph's stubborn insistence that he can walk by himself, Chris crouches down with a flat expression and firmly orders the lagging boy to get on his back. Chris warns them that if they don't want to move as a team, he will scrap the party idea right now. Ralph sweats profusely, clicking his tongue in annoyed realization. Turning to them, Chris challenges Ralph to show him how easily they can take down a goblin. Ralph confidently agrees with a smirk, while Hestia nods in understanding. Hestia tells Ralph to do what they always do, to which he readily agrees. The trio stalks cautiously through the tall grass of the dense forest. A lone goblin emerges into a clearing, completely unaware as Hestia points it out to Ralph from the brush. Hestia suddenly bursts from the tall grass, startling the goblin with a loud shriek. The goblin turns with a sinister, drooling grin as Hestia brandishes a wooden club. The creature lunges after Hestia with an excited chitter, completely missing Ralph hiding in the grass. Ralph watches intensely from the undergrowth as the goblin's foot steps right past his hiding spot. Exploding from cover, Ralph drives his blade squarely into the goblin's back while Hestia watches. Turning back to Chris, Hestia eagerly asks how their performance was. Ralph drops to one knee to wipe his blade as Hestia boasts that despite being clumsy, they easily killed the beast. Analyzing their teamwork, Chris notes that Hestia lures the goblin to the immobile Ralph so he can finish it off. Satisfied with their makeshift strategy, Chris officially agrees to form a party with them. Hestia throws her hands in the air, cheering ecstatically at the good news. Ralph defensively yells at Chris for teasing them, though Chris coldly reminds them he doesn't actually need a party to kill goblins. Smiling warmly, Hestia and Ralph sincerely tell Chris they are counting on him from now on. Agreeing to meet later, Chris announces he is heading home first so they can discuss the details tonight. Ralph indignantly yells after Chris, baffled that they aren't going to hunt together immediately after forming a party. The scene shifts to the exterior of the Rustic Adventurer Guild or boarding house later in the day. Ralph and Hestia arrive at Chris's room, proudly presenting the skewers they bought to celebrate. Chris reveals he also picked up a few things, realizing they all had the same idea to celebrate their first day. Placing a large bundle on the table, Chris notes he didn't bring skewers, but Ralph laughs that you can never have too many. Ralph and Hestia stare in absolute, wide-eyed shock at what Chris has unveiled. A lavish spread of premium food covers the table, including sashimi from Marilla, pork buns from Saikamanju, and takikomi rice from Muruha Shakudo. Drooling over the feast, Ralph marvels that these are famous dishes they have only ever seen from afar. Chris calmly invites them to eat since they are a party now, leaving Hestia stuttering in disbelief. The trio happily settles in, stuffing their faces with the incredible meal. Between bites, Ralph seriously asks Chris what his goals are moving forward. Chris clarifies he wants to know their actual purpose beyond vague ideas like just adventuring or eating their fill. Hestia sheepishly admits her personal goal is to become a mage and earn money. Chris stares directly at her, asking if she plans to leave the party once she achieves that goal. Caught off guard, Hestia nervously says she doesn't plan to leave, then quickly deflects the question back to Ralph. Ralph clenches his fist on the table, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. With quiet intensity, Ralph reveals that his ultimate goal is to take revenge on his brother. He adds that, if possible, he wants to achieve that dark goal while still belonging to their party. Hestia nervously stammers, asking what exactly he means by revenge. Chris cuts straight to the point, asking Ralph with a deadpan stare if he means he wants to kill his brother. Chris confirms a statement with a serious expression, setting a tense tone for the conversation. Ralph angrily yells at Chris to handle his problems himself, prompting Chris to calmly explain that he wouldn't be asking for help if he could defeat his target alone. Startled by the revelation, Ralph stammers as he processes the shocking fact that Chris's target is actually his own brother. A heavy silence falls over the group as the gravity of Chris's words sinks in. Chris confirms Ralph's deduction, adding grimly that his brother is also one of the strongest humans alive. Hesta timidly interjects, sensing a dark history and asking if there is a specific story behind this intense sibling rivalry. Realizing the truth, Ralph deduces that Chris's desperate escape to the monster-infested forest was directly caused by this conflict. Gazing into the distance, Chris admits that a mere trip was the only thing that saved him from certain death that day. Recalling his near-death experience, Chris declares with cold certainty that his brother Klaus will kill him if they ever meet again. Ralph empathizes with Chris, sharing his own past desire to kill his abusive stepfather and validating Chris's need for revenge. Despite understanding his pain, Ralph firmly draws a line and refuses to assist Chris in committing murder. Unbothered by the rejection, Chris calmly accepts Ralph's boundary, noting that merely understanding his motive is enough. Ralph suddenly panics, loudly accusing Chris of planning to use his mysterious dried weeds to poison Klaus. Chris casually dismisses the accusation, stating that a simple poison wouldn't be enough to take down someone known as the Sword God. When a bewildered Ralph demands to know the true purpose of the lethal plants, Chris admits he was waiting for the right moment to explain. Chris reveals that consuming the toxic herbs gradually draws out latent potential and strengthens the body, leaving his companion stunned. Ralph marvels at this incredible discovery, prompting Chris to note that he is likely the only person capable of surviving the toxic side effects to reap the benefits. Shifting the focus away from his own dark past, Chris directly asks the two what their personal ambitions are. Hesta shyly admits her goal is to become a useful mage for the party, a simple dream that Chris readily accepts. In stark contrast, Ralph violently declares his grand ambition to become the strongest, most widely recognized adventurer alive. Amused by the sheer audacity of the boy's dream, Chris lets out a genuine, uncharacteristic laugh. Hesta smiles warmly at Ralph, noting that such a boisterous and ambitious goal suits him perfectly. Flustered by their reactions, Ralph angrily yells at them to stop mocking him while Hesta delights in Chris's rare laughter. Regaining his composure, Chris points out that Ralph's ultimate dream directly aligns with his own mission. Chris explains that Klaus is considered a once-in-a-century prodigy destined to be a hero, meaning Ralph must surpass him to become the strongest. Hesta happily summarizes their intertwined fates, declaring her own objective is to support both of their ambitious dreams. With their paths perfectly aligned, Chris officially establishes the party's ultimate objective as surpassing the sword god Klaus. Both Ralph and Hesta enthusiastically agree, officially cementing their newly formed alliance. Chris inwardly lists their bizarre composition, noting they are a poison-immune farmer, a magicless mage, and a crippled holy knight. Despite their overwhelming disadvantages, this strange bond officially gives birth to the weakest, most unconventional party. Immediately grounding them in reality, Chris bluntly states that they are still far too weak to handle actual bronze rank quests together. Outraged by the sudden dismissal, Ralph yells and demands to know the point of forming a party if they aren't going to fight together. Chris calmly explains that their first priority must be healing Ralph's crippled leg and getting Hesta to learn actual magic. Ralph slowly understands the logic, asking if they will operate separately until those foundational goals are met. Chris decides to personally accompany Ralph to get his leg examined, ignoring Ralph's protests about not having the money for a doctor. Stepping up as the leader, Chris offers to cover the medical expenses, leaving Ralph deeply moved by the generous gesture. When Ralph emotionally thanks him, Chris cringes and calls him gross, insisting the investment is purely for his own future benefit. Turning to Hesta, Chris assigns her the task of researching a specific monster called the stray cowbird, while he takes Ralph to the clinic. He promises to pay her for any useful information she finds, ignoring her protests that he is already spending enough on Ralph's exam. Chris firmly shuts down her objections, insisting on fair compensation because money issues always breed messy conflicts later. Laying down the rules, Chris informs Hestia that their work, lodging, and meals will be split 3 ways. Standing before a grand building, Hestia agrees to accept payment properly as Chris places his trust in her. Inside a clinic, an elderly healer asks Chris and Ralph what brings them in today. Rolling up his pant leg, Ralph asks the healer to check an old injury. Examining the knee, the healer notes it looks pretty bad and asks when the injury occurred, prompting Ralph to groan that it happened about 7 years ago. The healer grimly diagnoses a completely torn ligament and a damaged meniscus resulting from leaving the wound untreated for so long. Devastated by the news, Ralph asks if his knee truly cannot be healed. Surprising them both, the healer firmly states that the injury can actually be fixed. He details a complex surgery that requires cutting open the knee to graft a new ligament and filling the meniscus with metal slime oil. Wondering about the price, Chris asks for an estimate, but the healer warns that the surgery costs a fortune and requires bringing their own oil. The healer reveals the procedure runs 20 platinum coins, leaving Ralph utterly shocked. Desperate for an alternative, Chris asks if there is another way since Ralph has been forcing the leg, but the healer refuses due to how long the injury has sat unchecked. The healer adds that a simple potion might have worked if they had caught the injury when it first happened. He firmly concludes that reconstruction surgery is the cheapest option available at the Healers Guild. Unconvinced by the exorbitant price, Chris asks if there is anywhere else that might be cheaper. Night quietly falls over the traditional rooftops of the bustling town. Peeking through a cracked door, Hestia calls out for Chris and the resting Ralph. Looking deeply concerned, she asks if Ralph's injury really cannot be healed. Catching her off guard, Chris reassures her that the situation is not completely hopeless. He explains that the guild can fix it for 20 platinum coins, meaning Ralph is just sulking like an idiot. Chris recounts how the healer suggested they look into someone named Blood who might be able to help them. Following the lead, Chris and the healer dug up background information on this mysterious Blood. They discovered that Blood used to be the best healer in the guild but left to charge insane prices as a wandering healer for difficult cases. However, as medical practices advanced, Blood's skills became outdated, leaving him scraping by in the capital's back alleys treating the poor. Chris sighs, noting that Ralph heard this tragic fall from grace, decided Blood was a letdown, and started sulking. Seeing a golden opportunity, Chris theorizes that if Blood has fallen that far, he might perform the surgery dirt cheap. Hestia finally understands the situation, looking softly toward the sleeping Ralph. Turning his attention back, Chris states that this entire situation brings him directly to Hestia. She immediately panics, explaining that Blood is in the capital where her brother is, meaning she cannot risk running into him. Ignoring her excuses, Chris orders her to accompany Ralph to the capital to talk to Blood, offering to cover travel costs since Ralph is too much of an idiot to negotiate alone. Taking in the view of the town, Hestia confidently agrees to handle the mission. Chris watches silently as Hestia and Ralph prepare to depart through the massive stone gates. Ralph looks downcast while Hestia speaks to him, leaving Chris standing alone in the distance. The majestic architecture of the capital's cathedral looms under the cloudy daytime sky. Refocusing on his own tasks, Chris notes that after countless trips, he finally identified which plants actually boost stats. With Ralph and Hestia gone to the capital, Chris heads into the Beisha forest to gather poisonous plants and discover new ones. He recalls finding a baseline toxic plant with cute purple blossoms near the Flesh King, which surprisingly boosts stamina despite the dead animal carcasses surrounding it. Next, he identifies a deceptive mushroom that looks poisonous at first sight but actually boosts endurance. Satisfied with finding stamina and endurance boosters, Chris declares his real goal is to uncover a plant that boosts strength. Journeying deeper, he arrives at a dark, ominous cave entrance nestled between rocky cliffs and twisted trees. Wandering through an untouched expanse of flora, Chris decides it is best to establish a new base in a familiar area without humans or monsters. Deep inside a rocky cave, he solidifies his plan to focus on harvesting the 2 specific plants proven to boost his stats. He designates the toxic flora as raisin grass and genpei fungus to easily track their effects. Carefully gathering the plants while leaving a few behind to regrow, he meticulously records their exact locations in his journal. Although he dreams of cultivating the poisonous plants himself, he notes that growing them in a dorm is impossible and renting a field is far too risky. Preparing a meal over a crackling campfire, he concludes that buying his own house is the only viable option despite it being a distant dream. He calculates that he desperately needs money to cover Hesta's spellbook, Ralph's medical fees, appraisal costs, and gathering expeditions. Staring into the void, he realizes that absolutely every single one of his problems ultimately comes down to money. Looking up at the drifting clouds, he quietly wishes there was a faster way to earn a substantial income. Standing in the forest with a determined expression, he proudly announces that his latest preparation is finished. A freshly cooked pot of genpei mushroom stew sits steaming next to a loaf of bread. Staring at his meal with hesitation, he admits the genpei grass tastes fine in the stew, but the second plant poses a much bigger problem. Holding a toxic raisin flower in his gloved hand, he remembers Hesta advising him to swallow it wrapped in an edible oblate film. He tosses the wrapped medicine into his mouth, noting that this new market item completely masks the terrible taste of the herbs. Swallowing the lethal dosage with ease, he celebrates the fact that the cheap wrappers allow him to consume the flora without suffering. Slumping back against the dirt in sheer relief, Chris rejoices that he finally managed to eat poisonous plants without enduring excruciating agony. 5 uneventful days smoothly pass in the sprawling wilderness of Beisha Forest. Trekking through the brush, Chris happily tallies his successful harvest of raisin grass, genpei fungus, and 20 newly discovered toxic plants. Suddenly, a chilling presence paralyzes him, draining the color from his face as he stares silently into the gloomy woods. Pressing his back firmly against a large tree, he curses himself for believing the terrifying rumors were fake just because he had never encountered the threat. He peeks frantically from behind the thick wooden trunk, completely overwhelmed by fear. A massive, heavily muscled beast with jagged stone-like horns and glowing eyes stomps fiercely through the foliage. Recognizing the colossal monster, Chris identifies the creature as Dukurus, the legendary lord of Beisha Forest. The terrifying Dukurus prowls forward, exuding an aura of absolute destruction. Chris remembers the grim lore stating that this beast marks anything it sees as prey and violently chases it to the ends of the earth. With a single, devastating swipe of its razor-sharp claws, the beast completely obliterates a massive tree trunk. The monstrous lord continues its menacing prowl through the splintered remains of the forest. Trembling and gasping for quiet breaths, Chris hides behind a thick tree as the enormous beast stalks right past his position. Gritting his teeth in sheer panic, he bitterly curses his terrible luck for suddenly ruining a perfectly successful expedition. The beast halts and looks around, forcing Chris to realize that it will inevitably discover his hiding spot any second now. Knowing he cannot possibly outrun the giant creature, Chris steels his nerves and decides he has no choice but to launch a preemptive strike. Scaling the massive tree, he leaps high into the air directly above the unsuspecting monster. Gripping his sword with deadly intent, he plummets toward the beast and screams out his attack. He drives his heavy blade downward with all his might, violently aiming to impale the creature. Believing his positioning and gravity-assisted strike to be absolutely flawless, Chris expects a decisive hit, but reality proves otherwise. Reacting with blinding speed, the monstrous beast brutally swats Chris away midair before the blade can land deeply. The creature's massive claws tear into Chris, instantly drawing blood and sending him flying with a pained gasp. Crashing heavily into the grass, Chris groans in agony as he struggles to lift his heavy sword. Looking up in absolute horror, he watches helplessly as the furious beast rapidly closes the distance. The Lord of Beisha Forest lets out a terrifying roar, opening its massive, jagged jaws to completely devour the wounded boy. Thrusting his blade forward, Chris jams his sword directly into the gaping maw of the massive, wolf-like beast. The creature violently throws Chris backward, causing his pouch of poisonous purple flowers to scatter into the air. Staring down the terrifying monster, Chris realizes that if the scattered Dayzen poison doesn't take effect immediately, he is going to die right here. Suddenly, the massive beast halts its advance and violently coughs up a thick pool of black blood. Seeing the poison clearly working on the monster, Chris reminds himself not to get conceited. Acknowledging that the immobilized Dukurus offers a golden chance, Chris quickly downs a healing potion since he is far from unscathed. With his resolve hardened, he plans to finish the creature with one decisive strike before it has any chance to retaliate. Gripping the hilt of his sword tightly, Chris locks his intense gaze onto the weakened beast. However, The massive monster raises its head and snarls, stubbornly refusing to fall. Bursting forward with incredible speed, Chris closes the distance between himself and the monster in an instant. His eyes burn with fierce determination as he charges headlong into the fray. Anticipating the attack, the giant beast retaliates by swinging its massive, glowing claw directly at the charging swordsman. The razor-sharp claws slice through the air, forcing Chris to brace himself against the sheer power of the incoming blow. The beast's devastating strike smashes into the ground, sending a massive shockwave of debris flying through the forest. Rising from the dust, the enormous creature whips its head around in sudden confusion as its attack seemingly misses the mark. Reappearing right beside the monster's blind spot, Chris sneers that the previous movement was just a feint. Channeling all his strength, he drives a devastating, explosive strike directly into the beast's face. The sheer force of the impact causes Chris's sword to shatter completely into jagged fragments. Despite the broken weapon, the powerful blow violently launches the massive creature backward into the air. The defeated monster crashes heavily onto the forest floor, kicking up a massive cloud of dust upon impact. Breathing heavily, a wide-eyed Chris stands in the silent forest, slowly processing his hard-fought victory. Utterly exhausted from the brutal encounter, he collapses to the ground a short distance away from the monster's lifeless corpse. Panting heavily, Chris admits to himself that for a brief second, he genuinely thought he was going to die. Later that night under the starry town sky, a bruised Chris pushes open the clinic door and announces his return. Sitting comfortably inside, Hestia warmly welcomes him home while Ralph takes a casual sip from his mug. Their relaxed expressions instantly morph into sheer horror as they stammer in shock at his battered appearance. Covered in blood and dirt, Chris explains he got ambushed by a monster in the forest and had to run straight back after killing it just in case another threat appeared. Panicking, Hestia asks if he has any serious injuries, but Chris casually reassures her that aside from a sore body from taking a few hits, he is perfectly fine. Ralph nervously assumes the forest is now completely off-limits, but Chris shocks them both by declaring he made sure the beast was dead and plans on heading right back out there again. Yelling loudly, Ralph tells him not to die on them while Hestia tugs his cloak to remind him he is part of their party now, prompting Chris to smirk and promise he has no intention of dying easily. Distracting the simple-minded Ralph with some meat skewers, Chris silently notes how easily manageable his party members can be. Turning his attention to the mission, Chris asks Hestia how her trip to the capital went, and she nods, confirming she successfully met up with Brad. She explains that the healer is currently struggling with money while living in the black market, and initially negotiated to do the surgery for 15 platinum coins. Proudly detailing her haggling skills, Hestia reveals she kept refusing until the desperate healer literally begged on his hands and knees to do the operation for just 5 coins. Chris's face lights up with sheer relief and surprise as he realizes 5 platinum coins is a price they can actually manage to pay. Looking uncertain, Hestia admits that 5 platinum coins still sounds insanely expensive to her and nervously asks if spending that much is truly alright. Leaning in, Chris firmly reassures her that it is perfectly fine, since treating the leg injury was the entire reason they formed this party in the first place. Pointing a stern finger directly at her, Chris declares that no matter what happens, she is going to learn magic. Hearing the word magic, Hestia's eyes instantly sparkle with wonder and excitement. Bowing deeply with profound gratitude, she enthusiastically thanks Chris as he awkwardly accepts her appreciation. Chris gently tells Hesta that since they are the same age, she should stop using honorifics so they can treat each other as equals. Looking up at him, Hesta simply stares in thoughtful silence. Much to his surprise, she respectfully declines and admits she prefers to keep addressing him formally. Stuffing his face with food, Ralph casually interjects that Chris shouldn't mind if that is what she truly wants. Ralph asks if killing a single monster was really the only thing he did, prompting Chris to scold him for talking with his mouth full. Dropping his heavy sacks onto the floor, Chris explains that he was ambushed on his way home but still managed to harvest plenty. Ralph stares nervously at the tied bags, correctly guessing that they are filled with newly gathered poison. He admits feeling overwhelmed because Chris is already far ahead of them and only widens the gap with each passing day. Chris bluntly reminds them to be grateful, pointing out that he cannot earn the money needed to help them if he doesn't continuously grow stronger. A quiet view of the village rooftops sets the scene as Ralph tries to explain that it's just a lingering feeling of inadequacy. A few days later, Chris treks alone through a vast, mountainous landscape under a clear sky. He halts on a rocky ridge, scanning the jagged horizon and confirming he has reached his destination. Pulling out a crumpled bounty poster, he officially resumes his adventuring career by hunting a beast known as the stray cowbird. Ignoring Hesta's advice to hunt in the crowded eastern plains, he strategically chose the abandoned northwest road because the competition is significantly lower. He silently navigates through a narrow, rocky gorge, keeping his eyes peeled for his target. Peeking from behind a massive boulder, he spots a winged, cow-like creature grazing peacefully by a shallow pool. The majestic beast proudly lifts its horned head, completely oblivious to the predator lurking nearby. Staying hidden in the shadows, Chris watches the beast and confirms it perfectly matches the bounty's description. He recalls that these creatures are highly valued as food, noting their wings are only used for powerful jumps rather than actual flight. Mentally reviewing his strategy, he remembers that cautious play invites a deadly horn charge while underestimating them leads to a crushing body slam. To survive, a hunter must rely on long-range attacks or perfectly dodge every slam in close-quarters combat. Stepping out into the open, Chris draws his sword and boldly approaches the grazing monster. The beast turns sharply as Chris leaps high into the air, using gravity to his advantage. With blinding speed, he swings his heavy blade right as the horned creature prepares to counterattack. He delivers a devastating slash across the beast's neck, striking it down before it can even mount a proper defense. Fluidly swapping his sword for a heavy mallet, Chris prepares a secondary strike as the injured monster roars in agony. He viciously slams the mallet into the beast's skull, knocking it out completely to ensure the kill doesn't ruin the meat. Hoisting the massive carcass onto a sturdy tree branch, he carefully drains the blood and removes the guts to maximize its market value. Knowing the guild only requested specific cuts, he decides to butcher it on site to minimize the immense weight he has to carry back. Meanwhile, back in the bustling city streets, citizens go about their day near a grand fountain. Inside a local butcher shop, a tired worker wiping a bloody cleaver apologizes for the mess and directs his customer to the entrance. The butcher's jaw drops in absolute shock as he stares at the towering shadow looming in his doorway. A stunned worker asks if Chris really hauled the entire monster back, to which Chris casually explains that chopping it up felt like a waste. Inspecting the massive carcass, the butcher praises the perfect bleeding and clean gutting, thrilled by how fresh the meat is. The amazed butcher admits that this might be the finest stray cowbird they have ever received, noting that almost no one brings the whole thing intact. Chris simply stares back expectantly, asking if they are willing to pay a premium price for such exceptional quality. The butcher calls for his assistant to help carve and appraise the beast, telling Chris to wait for the final tally. Refusing Chris's coin, the generous butcher offers him a free meal on the house as an extra reward for his excellent labor. Stepping outside the rustic shop, Chris is instructed to enjoy his free food while the appraisal finishes. Tossing a heavy pouch of coins, Chris smiles as he realizes they bumped his reward up to 5 gold coins simply because the beast was perfectly prepared. Reviewing his recent efforts, Chris notes that the bronze quest took a whole day to gather info but ultimately netted more than the usual 4 silver coins. Arriving back home covered in blood, Chris realizes he could save up a lot of money in no time at this rate. Handing over the month's cut, Chris explains that hunting stray cowbirds is tough since finding them usually takes about 4 days. Counting his earnings from the first day, he calculates a total of 26 gold coins pulled in over the entire month. Turning his attention away from the money, Chris directly calls out to Hestia. Reaching into his belongings, Chris pulls out a thick, worn-out volume and presents it. Spotting the ratty old book, Ralph questions its origin while Hestia stares in complete shock. Utterly stunned, Hestia realizes that the item Chris is holding is actually a rare grimoire. Chris bluntly explains that he bought it with his savings because their constant struggling on goblin hunts will eventually drag him down too. Overwhelmed by his unexpected generosity, Hestia looks down as tears begin to well up in her eyes. Unable to contain her emotions, she cries out his name in deep gratitude. Weeping openly, Hestia sincerely thanks him from the bottom of her heart for such an incredible gift. Dismissing her thanks, Chris orders her to learn magic and start pulling her weight, though she continues praising him for always looking after them. Wiping away her tears, Hestia fiercely declares that she will master magic no matter what it takes. Watching her newfound determination, Chris silently acknowledges that she has changed significantly since they first formed the party. Answering Ralph's confusion, Chris explains that the grimoire is packed with magic theory and serves as a tool for learning magic. Ralph pumps his fist in sheer excitement, thrilled by the revelation that Hestia can actually learn magic for real. However, reality quickly sets in as Ralph realizes that if Hestia successfully learns magic, he will remain the sole dead weight in the party. Looking completely dejected, Ralph admits out loud that he is genuinely scared of being left behind. Chris coldly retorts that Ralph has always been useless, but the only difference now is that he actually realizes it. Refocusing on their goal, Chris instructs Hestia to learn magic quickly so they can finally start taking bronze-ranked quests and make real money. Eager to begin, Hestia enthusiastically agrees and readies herself for the task. Reading from the ancient text, Hestia notes that the very first step before casting any spell is learning to control mana. Guiding her through the process, Chris tells her to picture a river flowing through her body and to practice speeding it up and slowing it down. Deciding to join in, Ralph confidently declares he will try the water circulation exercise too. As he focuses, Ralph wonders out loud if they can actually learn such a complex skill simply by copying the book's instructions. Giving up almost instantly, Ralph complains that he doesn't feel a damn thing and is just getting sleepy from the effort. Ignoring Ralph's failure, Chris turns his attention back to Hestia to check on her progress. Suddenly, a massive, swirling aura of powerful energy violently erupts around Hestia's body. Completely freaked out by the intense display, Ralph screams in panic, demanding to know what is happening to her. Sitting calmly within the swirling vortex, Hestia reassures them she is fine and assumes this energy must be mana. A confident smile crosses her face as she remarks that she might already be getting the hang of the flow. Chris tells Ralph not to worry since this is just mana control, secretly marveling that she pulled it off with merely a couple of spoken lines. Panicking as the energy intensifies, Ralph screams that it is getting stronger by the second and looks incredibly unsafe. Releasing a heavy sigh, Hestia diffuses the swirling aura and decides to stop for the moment. Watching the display, Chris realizes this monstrous talent is exactly what is expected from someone granted the mage class during the Rite of Revelation. The air settles as Hestia quietly processes the incredible power she just successfully channeled. Moving to the next step, Chris instructs her to light a candle and focus on turning her mana into fire through visualization. Fully determined, Hestia immediately agrees to try the new training exercise right away. Annoyed by his presence, Chris questions why Ralph is tagging along, and the swordsman casually admits he has nothing better to do. While waiting for Hestia to finish her magic studies, Chris surprises Ralph by offering to teach him the basics of swordsmanship. Ralph admits he lacks proper training and eagerly accepts the offer because he hates feeling outmatched, while Chris acknowledges the absolute necessity of developing his party members. Overflowing with sudden enthusiasm, Ralph excitedly refers to Chris as his master and begs for his guidance. This intense dedication briefly triggers an exasperating memory of previous aspiring students swarming Chris and screaming for his tutelage. Disgusted by the unwanted flashback, Chris sharply orders the boy to drop the honorific because it makes his skin crawl. Wasting no more time, the two boys clash their wooden training swords together in a fierce practice duel. The older swordsman easily dominates the exchange, aggressively driving Ralph backward with relentless, heavy strikes. Nursing a painful blow to the face, Ralph groans in pain while Chris silently critiques his smooth but fundamentally flawed movements. Chris resolves to mercilessly drill the basics into the young holy knight, knowing the boy's latent talent will cause him to grow exponentially once his foundation is solid. Their grueling training session is suddenly interrupted when Hestia cheerfully calls out Chris's name from the nearby woods. A glowing flame hovers above Hestia's finger, prompting Ralph to marvel at her success while she proudly boasts about lighting the fire. Ralph wonders if the girl is simply a prodigy or if magic is just naturally easy to learn, but Chris is genuinely stunned that she managed to cast a spell in under 30 minutes. Eager to advance, Hestia immediately asks to move on to proper spellcasting, though Chris points to the grimoire and instructs her to practice shooting the flame first. The confident girl insists she already understands the feeling of the spell and wants to skip the basics entirely, an arrogant decision Chris flatly refuses to argue against. Turning her bright attention to Ralph, Hestia enthusiastically declares that she will not hold back in helping both of them grow stronger. Sweating under the pressure of her rapid progress, Ralph inwardly vows to push himself even harder because his pride refuses to let him be left behind.